And welcome to today's episode of Let's Talk About Things. Joining me is an all-star panel consisting of Bethany Hallam, County Councilor in Allegheny County, Ari Teer, who is spokesperson for the Democratic Socialists of America. I hope I got that right. And Joe Reynolds. No, I did not. Who are you?
Campaign manager for Olivia Bennett on County Council. But yeah, I'm probably spokesperson for every single Democratic Socialist in all of America. Absolutely.
Exactly. And we also have Joe Reynolds, former candidate for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate in South Carolina. And we are going to start this off with breaking news from this past week. The Supreme Court has ruled that Trump is not above the law, but that the effort to get his taxes goes back to the lower courts. And just this Friday night, he has announced that he is commuting the sentence of Roger Stone. Do you guys want to give some thoughts about that?
Of course. I mean, I'll start off. Because
sure.
You know, when with Roger Stone, I guess if that's where we want to start. So I think that it is something that we all saw coming, right? I think most of us knew that was something that was going to happen. But the reality is we're in a point in time right now where we're talking about decreasing mass incarceration, and Trump is so against that. But yet when it comes to his friends and his political allies, let him out of jail. But when it comes to someone who's sending a life sentence right now for, you know, a dime bag of marijuana, he's not worried about them, right? He has no sympathy for someone like that. So I think that that's really where we see the disconnect here, and I think where we really see who Trump is as a person, because if it doesn't affect him personally, he doesn't care. And if it does, he'll go through any lengths to make sure he's protecting himself. It is like typical narcissistic traits to me. So I just think there's been a lot of conflicting things that he's putting out where his words say one thing and his actions show another. So if we want to not be incarcerating people right now, if we want to use COVID as an excuse, which I think is a great reasoning for releasing people who shouldn't be there, then let's do it for everyone. It doesn't just apply to Trump and his cronies.
Ari.
I think I am one of these people. I have a hard time focusing on things like Trump's tax returns or Roger Stone, even though it is flagrant nepotism and just, it's something that we're so used to. But at the same time, I'm just worried about people and working during the middle of this pandemic, and what are we doing to help them? And it's a complete lack of leadership across the United States right now. COVID cases are soaring. So I have a pretty impossible time focusing on, sometimes these national issues. And I do think that we suffer from a type of politics in the U.S. where it's Washington politics versus everybody else. And, right now in Allegheny County, we just saw a huge spike of COVID cases back in my hometown in South Carolina. They have more cases right now in my home county in Horry County. It's about 5,000 cases versus 4,000. And that's with a county that's a third of the size compared to Pittsburgh area. The other thing too, sure, we see nepotism all over and just flagrant abuses of power from Trump. The latest thing that I read was about the Aberdeen golf courses and possible money laundering happening there. So it's just a really cynical time for politics in America, because how can you feel engaged? And what's happening in Washington is just benefit Trump and his cronies and allies and whatever, and the rest of America just kind of gets stuck with nothing. So,
Joe, you want to jump in here?
I was a little cynical before the decision, but I saw it went 7-2 in both cases, well, thank goodness, for future presidents, and that may have been what they were looking at. Some of these conservative judges saying, well, in the future, there's going to be a Democratic president, and if we give them this kind of power, they're going to take it. And is that what we really want? They maybe see the writing on the wall for President Trump. They see the possibility he won't be there next January, and they want to be able to secure these constitutional provisions that protect us from the president and, his abuses of power. Good for them. As far as Roger Stone is concerned, I think like like the other ladies here, I saw it, we all saw it coming. It's like I've said, Reynolds' law, if there is no remedy for a rule being broken, then there is no rule. And Trump has proven that customs and norms are really not effective with a president like him. We're going to have to look at these kind of things next year, maybe, and codify some of the problems we have with the presidency, instead of thinking that, no, somebody will be too ashamed to actually go through with this. We've seen the worst of Trump. He's not ashamed at all to let one of his crony crooks off the hook. But like Ari says, nobody really cares. Everything right now is about the coronavirus. Everything right now is about schools. Everything right now is about how is the federal government going to help us, or how are states doing with this coronavirus. And I think people have moved on already from the Roger Stone thing. And maybe that's what Trump suspected all along.
Yeah, and I actually agree a lot with you, Joe, about why the Supreme Court is doing, has handled this case specifically the way they did, because it, in their eyes, it's possible that come January of next year, there is a Democratic president in office. And I know that's what I'm hoping for, but it's possible. And so my favorite quote, and it was from Chief Justice John Roberts in the tax return case, was that no citizen, not even the president, is categorically above the common duty to produce evidence when called upon in criminal proceedings. So it really is setting a precedent that if there is a Democratic president that comes in next year, or any time in the future, we need to make sure that we're protecting us from that. It shouldn't just apply to Trump. It shouldn't just apply to Barack Obama, right? It should apply to everyone, regardless of political party, regardless of if you agree with them or not. And that's why I see a lot of things lately coming from the GOP, that I can't disagree with, which, being a left-leaning Democrat, I never thought that'd be something I'd say. But like, for example, when we're talking about Trump right now is suing me, okay? As a member of the Board of Elections of Allegheny County, Donald Trump is suing me right now because he is trying to change the rules in Pennsylvania regarding different aspects of the electoral process. And so the thing is, I don't completely disagree with most of Trump's lawsuit. There's some pieces of it that I think are wrong and are, inherently flawed. But at the end of the day, if we aren't standing up for the basic rights of people, and we're not standing up to the basic rule of the law, we can't apply it to certain people and not other folks. It needs to apply to one uniform.
Bethany, I think we're going to have to quote tweet that. Trump is suing me.
Trump is, yes, I'm going to make a lawsuit.
That's the headline of the pod. Trump is suing me.
Yeah, I just want to say to an earlier point, Bethany, that you made, that this is a president who, by the way, in 2018, a lot of people don't remember this because it's 20 lifetime cycles ago. He signed into law a major bill of criminal justice reform, and he seems to be running away from it right now. And to your point, he has no problem pardoning the people who are, who are his cronies. But, if you think that the president who signed this major bill of criminal justice reform would be campaigning on that, and yet he seems to be totally fine with prosecuting those who don't support him.
This goes along with, what I've said about politics right now. Everybody wants to run as an outsider. So Trump, even though he has all the levers of power and he has a Republican Senate and previously had a Republican House, he always wants to run against the government, against the deep state, against Dr. Fauci, against the CDC. And there's nobody who's really taking responsibility for anything anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah. So Bethany, we're going to come back to you. We're just going to talk very quickly about a House race in South Carolina. But there is a House race down in the Deep South, in the Charleston and Beaufort suburbs along the coast of South Carolina. This district is South Carolina 1. It was won by Donald Trump by 13%, but was won by a Democrat in 2018. And Joe, I think you have a lot to say about this particular race.
Well, it's started out this was historically, this was Mark Sanford's seat, and he had a pretty safe seat. And but what happened to Mark was what happened to Jeff Flake and Bob Corker and a couple other people who didn't like the way Trump was handling the deficit or handling some of our spending, and he went against Trump on a few occasions. Well, Trump couldn't stand for that, and he decided to, at the last minute, support this candidate, Katie Arrington. She spent all her money and she got just over the line, and she won that primary against Mark Sanford, and he was out of the race. Well, the problem with that was she was running against a pretty, good candidate in Joe Cunningham. He's a pretty even-handed and level-headed guy, and he had these brewery tours. He was on the ground. He was meeting the people, and people just kind of liked him. And he had all his money saved up. Katie Arrington didn't have a dime left, and he caught her on flat-footed on this offshore drilling business. She had previously said she supported Trump in offshore drilling. Then she saw the writing on the wall for that the coastal Carolina didn't like it at all, especially these islands like Folly Beach and Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms. These kind of communities said, no, we don't want offshore drilling. So she flipped on it, and that even hurt her more with the flip-flopping. So he had a lot of enthusiasm. He worked really hard. I've met him several times myself. He's pretty, he's got kind of that Southern charm about him. And I find that even Republicans who are diehard Trump supporters, give him a little bit of credit because of his constituent services, his outreach, his ability to go in front of crowds and just take the hits and talk to people. And you might find some crossover there, but it's a presidential year. President Trump is very welcomed in a lot of places. I know Ari's going to talk a little bit about how the community is going left a little bit in Charleston area in this district, and that's probably true. But you're going to have some straight ticket voting in South Carolina. It's one of those states you can just put Republican on, and that's all you have to do, which I disagree with. So Cunningham's going to have a tough time, but he might have a lot of crossover from Democrats.
And Ari, right. So Ari, right before I bring you in, I just want to talk about something because it ties into an issue that you have talked about a lot, and that is the fact that Joe Cunningham's challenger, Republican Nancy Mace, has been adamant that she opposes offshore drilling. She's even accused Joe Cunningham of lying about her record on that. And also, there's a group on the right called the American Conservation Coalition, which has put out its response to the Green New Deal called the American Climate Contract. And Nancy Mace is on record as supporting it. So I find it interesting that this issue of offshore drilling in the environment is tied really into this race. But I know that you have a lot to say about that, so please jump in.
Conservative plans for the environment do not meet the standard of the Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal is going to take us further, faster, which we need before we destroy the planet in just a matter of years. So even though it's nice, sure, conservatives are getting in on the game now and saying, oh, the environment matters. It's not genuine, and it's not going to address the issue to the broad scale that we need to address the issue. My home state, I grew up about 2 hours north of Charleston. My home state is rapidly changing, and the demographics are, it's younger, more people from all over the country are moving to southern states. They're moving to places like the Sun Belt, and that represents for us a political opportunity to change things. So sure, even though South Carolina is one of the reddest of the red states, you start to see these coastal areas go more blue. North Carolina, for example, flipped blue for Obama. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible in the South. I do think it's a huge uphill battle for a Democrat to win, but it's huge that Joe Cunningham even won to begin with. And I think it's issues like the environment that you're going to see more people like Cunningham win on. I think people like Bethany, who's with us right now, are the future of politics in the same way that Joe Cunningham is the future of politics. We need young, vibrant millennials with bold ideas out there. And Joe Cunningham also is someone who has a scientific background. So he's backed by like 314 PAC, and he studied like engineering. Like, he knows the environment. And that's something that we don't see a lot of in terms of in our political class. We don't see enough scientists in there making decisions, even though living in the middle of the right now, absolutely crushed by climate change. I grew up, like I said, 2 hours away, and my mother lost her home due to a flood, due to Hurricane Florence, which came through in about 2018. And that flooding is all along the southern coast of South Carolina. It's happening in places like Myrtle Beach and Charleston. And we're simply not gonna have these beautiful historic cities anymore if we don't act on it now. And the offshore drilling for Cunningham's opponent, Nancy Mace, while it's interesting that Republicans, she's a woman, she's the first graduate of the Citadel, historically male military college. She has somewhat been outspoken on like women's issues and spoke about an assault and things like that. We can't forget that Republicans, this is the group that wants to repeal the Hyde Act. Okay, so we have to know where Republicans actually stand on women's rights. So for me, it's kind of bizarre, but also pretty similar to see, Republicans kind of get in on this identity game in a way. But if you really want to know where power lies, look at Nancy Mace's donors, because her donors are like Koch industry, they're candidates that are backed by oil drilling, and people in Charleston and all along South Carolina coast are not. They love.
Well, Bethany, if you want to jump in, feel free to interrupt me. But unless other than that, I'd like to bring it from the Sun Belt back to the Rust Belt. Let's talk about Pennsylvania, some high-profile elections taking place in Pennsylvania, and I want to start with the race for Auditor General, because it is quite possibly the most fascinating race that I have seen so far taking place this year. It's the only state row office that is an open race. The Republican is Timothy DeFore, who is the controller of Dauphin County, which is where Harrisburg is located. Nina Ahmad is the Democrat. I believe she is from Philadelphia. It's actually interesting to note, no matter who wins, there will be the first non-white state row officer in Pennsylvania history, I think. And what I want to know is, how do you guys see this race? Because I actually see this as the best opportunity for Republicans to pick up this seat in Pennsylvania, because people see Timothy DeFore as the experienced moderate, whereas they see Ahmad as the inexperienced polarizing progressive. But I'm sure you'll see it differently. Bethany, you start.
Yeah, sure. Well, this race was tough for me because I'm a big Nina Ahmed fan, but I had endorsed Michael Lamb in the primary because I just think that he would have been the perfect person for the job. But, now that the primary's over, we can talk about that some other time. But the fact that Pennsylvania, especially home to places like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, have never had a person of color in a statewide row office is so problematic and tells you a lot about the fact that when people think about Pennsylvania, they think about Philly and they think about Pittsburgh and, maybe Erie and Harrisburg, but they don't realize that the rest of the state is pretty solidly red. And so we're starting to see some counties flip blue, and we're starting to, we're still 9 seats away from a majority in the state house, and we're still from a majority in the state senate. But I do think that this race is going to be very interesting because Nina hands down ran as the progressive choice in this race. And so to see a progressive win statewide, to me, is fascinating. I mean, I'm really excited about the fact that she has pledged to audit the Department of Corrections in the state of Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of really progressive policies that she holds and gives hope to folks for seeing more progressive folks running for the statewide row offices. I, for one, am hoping every day that Josh Shapiro does not end up being our governor in a couple years. Running as well, but I think that if Nina can pull this off, that definitely sets a great precedent in the same way that we've flipped some, safe blue seats in Allegheny County from more conservative Democrats to progressive Democrats over the past few years. So it gives people hope that we can do it countywide, we can do it statewide, and then hopefully we can bring someday a progressive to the White House. So I'm hoping that this sets an awesome precedence for the future.
Ari?
What I think is unique about Nina's race is, comparatively, here in Allegheny County, we've run a lot of really bootstrapped, grassroots funded campaigns. Nina put in $500,000 of her own money, but I love that in a way because it speaks to the power of messaging, good old-fashioned communications, and I think that is a great part about what made her race different in a lot of ways is the amount of television advertising. And I think it's good for women come into a lot of races at a disadvantage, especially women of color, Black women. They come into races and they don't always have those early advertising dollars that matter. So if if you have the ability, I say go for it. I also think that Nina's going to do a good job. I watched her race closely when she ran for governor. I voted for her as well for Auditor General. And it is something that is kind of uplifting. It gives me a lot of hope to think that we're going to put more women of color in high-level offices in our state. And another thing, since we're talking about Trump suing Bethany, we have like 75,000 more, you can correct me on this number, 70,000-ish more Democrats register in the state of Pennsylvania, which is really important now going into a presidential year, because the last presidential election, it was something like 46,000 that disappeared and went to the Trump Central. So hopefully we've claimed that Democrats back again and grown that more. So I hope that Pennsylvania flips to be a blue state the November election this year.
So we're going to get the information in a second about whether there are 70,000 more Democrats in Pennsylvania. But I just want to point out that there was an argument to be made that I saw on Elections Daily a few weeks ago, that essentially that Nina Ahmad is running as a progressive, that her campaign website has talked about support for Medicare for all and for the Green New Deal and for a $15 an hour minimum wage. The worry is that she would nationalize the race in a way that Tim DeFore is not, because of the way that he's campaigning, and that she would be much more reliant on Joe Biden's coattails to be able to pull out the win. So, I mean, I just want to go around the table to see where you guys all think this race stands, because I personally think it's a toss-up.
Well, I've seen Pennsylvania, the old Carville saying it's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between. And Nina is going ahead with some of this more activist programs for the Auditor General, who has traditionally been a more, we're going to study the finances of certain departments, but now she's going to be more activist, which is great for progressives, I suppose. But when you start talking about gun control legislation, things like that, you're going to have that large swath of red Pennsylvania say, wait a minute, we don't want that. And the other, candidate he's a Republican. He seems, a guy with a lot of experience being an FBI agent, et cetera. And even though Nina has got a wealth of experience, she's a chemist, she's got a PhD. I can see people saying, well, this guy is a former federal agent. He's been involved. He's more of an auditor than Nina is, and he's not going to take away our guns, because I'm telling you, come November, it's all going to be guns, guns, guns.
Right. So, and that's certainly something that I would be definitely keeping my eye on. I mean, we can all agree this is going to be a competitive race.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but something that I think, I definitely agree that I see it as very much of a toss-up. Something that worries me is, and I feel like often conversations turn to this as just racism and blatant racism that we've seen in Pennsylvania. And the fact that both candidates are people of color, I actually think it gives an advantage to someone like Nina, who there is no race argument that plays into facts here, because both of our candidates are minority candidates and they both have an equal shot at winning this. I just pulled up the Pennsylvania voter registration numbers. So as of the January 1st of this year, there's about 8.5 million registered voters, 4 million Democrats, and 3.2 million Republicans, and then the rest are party candidates. So the problem is that I agree with Ari that we had a Democratic advantage, especially in the 2016 election, and we still lost it. The thing that worries me the most is the rate at which Republicans are registering new Republican voters compared to the rate at which Democrats are registering new Democratic voters. So since 2015,
Ben Forsythe talked about that.
Yeah, Ben Forsythe is the best person to talk about, to look at like Pennsylvania and especially Allegheny County, just numbers. And I'm more of a visual person, so seeing the way that he puts those numbers into the maps is fascinating to me. But yeah, since 2015, Republicans have registered 258,000 new voters, and the Democrats have only registered 85,000 new voters. So that is a horrible for us as Democrats, because we need everything we can get. In Pennsylvania in 2016, Donald Trump won by 44,000 votes. and we had a registration advantage. So the concern to me is more so the fact that we have Democrats who are voting for Republicans, even in the highest office of the land. We have Democrats who are voting for Trump, and we're going to have it again this year. People aren't necessarily changing their registration maybe, but they are voting for Republicans as registered Democrats in the general. And that's what I think we need to watch out for. I do hope that I see more ground game from Joe Biden in Pennsylvania, because what I've been seeing lately is trash. They very heavily state party as opposed to having their own organization within the Commonwealth. And I think that's, as someone who is a state committee member, I can tell you that's not the best way to go, is to rely on your party. You need those grassroots organizers. So I actually predict that Nina is going to outperform Joe Biden in Pennsylvania.
Really? That's a bold claim.
She is the candidate. She's going to do the work. She has the progressive coalitions behind her that Joe Biden doesn't have. So I'm really excited to see how that turns out, but that's what I'm expecting.
Bold claim. And
I heard something interesting from, I think it was Rachel by Kofer recently about how there are no swing voters anymore. There is only turnout. So either you get a Trump election of 2016 where you have people who usually don't vote and say, you know, I like this businessman, he's crazy, and we need to blow it up, and they go out and vote. Or you get this year, 2018, rather, that, you know, a bunch of Democrats who had been sitting on the sidelines say, you know, I got to come out and vote. So it's all, she seems to claim it's all about turnout. It's not necessarily about switching, about these imaginary swing voters anymore.
I agree, and I wish the mainstream media would stop spending so much time talking about swing voters and talk about how we can increase turnout, because that's something that I don't see the Democratic Party doing. It's focusing on turnout. To me, we have an awesome opportunity in Pennsylvania where it's the first year we're ever able to vote by mail with no excuse. And so you see Pennsylvania GOP at the beginning of the year was actually pushing heavily on getting their folks to register to mail-in vote at the same time that Trump was saying, oh, mail-in voting is fraudulent. So I think that if the Democrats really push turnout via making sure that everyone receives an application to vote by mail. Again, Ben Forstate made a map the other day of vote by mail versus in-person voting all across the Commonwealth. And Allegheny County, where we sent a mail-in voting application to every single registered voter, was the red and orange, which meant highest percent of mail-in voting compared to anywhere else in the entire Commonwealth. So I really do see that it is, and it is up to the counties to decide how they're going to get creative, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, whether that's having staffed Dropbox locations, whether that's having, Act 77 also allowed us to have satellite voting locations where you can actually vote prior to Election Day at a county facility. And also to ensure we're, again, sending out mail-in ballot applications to every registered voter, because to me, as much as I'd like to only send them to Democrats, right? The way that I feel, as I mentioned earlier, is if you are against voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement, you are against it regardless of party. So we need to be increasing turnout of everyone. I want everyone to participate in our democracy. I want everyone to have the obstacles to voting removed for them. I want everyone to feel safe voting and feel that their vote counts and that's regardless of party. So that's why I think it's so important that we're really, really pushing the mail-in voting, especially with the uncertainty of what does coronavirus come November 3rd. No one knows. And it'll be coinciding with flu season. I'm just really concerned about what it looks like. And if we don't make a plan now for how to keep voters safe and make sure they're able to vote without waiting in lines for hours like we saw in the primary, we need to have that plan now. We need to be ready to go now as opposed to waiting till October to figure it out.
Well, I think while we're shamelessly plugging people, I'd like to take a moment to say that one of the places I'll be watching are what Dr. Laura Putnam calls the middle suburbs surrounding Allegheny County. See how big Trump's margins there. But in the auditor race, I'll certainly be looking at Dauphin County because it's actually more of a swing county as opposed to a Democratic one. It could vote for DeFore because he's there. And I've noticed that that Pennsylvania has a tendency of that candidates from a particular region have more support in that region. And I've noticed that that's been a fixture of Pennsylvania politics for a while. But
it says their county under their name on the ballot, just like when you run in Allegheny County, it says your township or borough under your name. And there's been tons of studies that I've seen even locally showing how much that actually helps you by depending on what county or what municipality you have listed under your name. The one I guess saving grace that I have for Dauphin County is because it is Harrisburg, is I like to think that the folks who are living there, you know, maybe we have a lot of folks who are working in the Capitol who are living and registered in Harrisburg, that they're pretty woke and know what's going on. And I'm hoping to see through any of the bullshit and realize that Nina's the best candidate for this job. So we'll see.
We'll see. But to the question, by the way, I'm going to bring everyone else in a second, okay? But I actually like to pose this question, to everyone. This is something that Bethany was talking about, and it's the issue with mail-in voting. We've actually talked about how Allegheny County reduced the number of polling stations in the primary as an incentive to encourage people to vote by mail. I was wondering, I was saying at the time, I think it's a good, what? Sorry, say that one more time.
Sorry, the reason that they consolidated polling locations was not to encourage people to vote by mail. It was some lame excuse that we didn't have enough poll workers, which was not true because many poll workers were contacted. But yeah, trying to incentivize people to mail in vote. I mean, I sure hope that wasn't their plan, but publicly, the reason they did it was to because they didn't have poll workers. But
well, color me corrected. Anyone else have thoughts about making voting accessible before we move on?
I want to say
just that Republicans are fooling themselves if they think that they can carry on this idea of we're going to try to keep fewer and fewer people from voting.
Right.
You can do that one time. You can do it another time. You can do it 3 or 4 times. But eventually, it's going to break open, and you'll never be able to recover. Because it's unfair to people, and we should, just say everybody should vote. And there are studies showing that Republicans get as much of a vote out of it as Democrats do. So let's go for it.
Ari, jump in. Last word.
We know that when we expand voting access for everybody, you have more of a democracy, plain and simple. And it's better for progressives, especially because a lot of the time, if we just increase turnout, then our candidates win. For example, Summer Lee, she got 50% turnout this last cycle and absolutely crushed her opponent with something like 76% of the vote. And that was despite the fact that, as Bethany was saying, Allegheny County consolidated from like over 1,000 polling locations to just a few hundred. Now, I don't necessarily like the fact that we reduced the number of polling locations during COVID, but I do think it was good that the county mailed an application for the mail-in ballot to everyone. So yeah, I'm all for it. We've got to expand the Voting Rights Act. We got to look at states like Georgia, where Stacey Abrams had several 100,000 votes that went missing. We have to protect and expand our democracy, the right to vote for everyone. So
we can't just depend on voters to, us saying, we need to reduce the voters as Republicans, because maybe that's just saying, well, your message stinks. Right. So, we need to adjust our message to attract more people instead of trying to get a smaller and smaller pool of voters. You can shake and bake for a while, but after, a certain period of time, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and I actually think that it's inevitable, in my opinion, that Trump turns his opinion around on mail-in voting, because I think looking at numbers all across the country and looking at how Democrats won races in areas where they increased turnout because of mail-in voting, I think that eventually Trump has to, a rational person would have to see the writing on the walls.
Didn't he vote by mail himself, though?
He votes by mail. So exactly. And then especially, like I said, like Pennsylvania's GOP that was encouraging vote by mail. Everyone else seems to realize that vote by mail is the way to win elections except Trump. So I hope he doesn't realize it. But I think it's inevitable that he has to figure it out eventually.
I would like to point out that the idea that Democrats benefit from vote by mail is a myth. There was a special election in California, and the GOP overperformed in the mail-in ballot. So I don't think they have anything to lose by instituting mail-in voting.
And access to voting for everyone.
Exactly. Joe, we're going to bring you back in a few. I want to talk about some state house races that are on my radar. We had the primaries just a few weeks ago in Pennsylvania, and I just want to tell you some of the races that are on my radar, and you guys can tell me the ones that are on yours. House District 28, Rob Mercury versus Emily Skopov. Held by, I believe, the former Speaker of the Pennsylvania House. House District 30, Lori Mizgorski versus Lisa Schulman. House District 36, AJ Doyle versus Jessica Benham. And House District 44, Valerie Gatos versus Michelle Knoll. And I'm just curious just because, well, three of those four I think are going to be very competitive. The other one is interesting because I think history is being made that versus Jessica Benham. So do you guys want to talk about these races and jump in with races that are on your radar as well? Bethany, you go first.
Yeah, I'll start. I think out of those four races, Jessica Benham's race is the one that I'm absolutely the least worried about. I think that she, you never sleep on your opponent no matter what your race is, but I think that that's one of those four that I'm pretty confident that Jess pulls away with, which I think is amazing. I mean, the first openly bisexual and autistic member of the PA House, that's a huge, come up success for us here in Pennsylvania, and a lot of folks who have never had representation in their local government before finally seeing someone who represents them, and I think that's awesome. I'm kind of a cynic when it comes to some of those other ones. I hate to say it. I mean, all of the Democrats in those other three races, Michelle Knoll, Lissa Geiger-Schulman, and Emily Skopov, are all friends of mine. I just think that it's a lot different trying to flip a seat in a presidential year than it is in, 2 years ago or in 2 more years when there's not a presidential race on the ballot. So I'm not super confident about all of them. I think Michelle Knoll is in a really flippable seat. Emily Skopov, she actually lost that seat to Speaker Mike Turzai 2 years ago by only 9.5 points. And then in Lissa's race, it's actually really interesting because she had a very competitive primary where, again, another progressive female to win against the endorsement of the Allegheny County Democratic Committee and the labor endorsement as well. She didn't receive either of those endorsements, and the people spoke, and she wanted the primary. So she had a really competitive primary. So that always concerns me going into a general is, does that beat you down so much that it's hard to keep that seat in the general? But the person that she's running against, is also a newcomer to the state legislature. She actually 2 years ago, Lori Mizgorski, she just got that seat after Hal English, who was the incumbent Republican representative in that district, after he stepped out of the race in the middle of the primary in 2018. Or actually, I think it was after the primary in 2018. He stepped out, and the Republican committee actually picked Lori to run in his place. So, she, again, a lot of it, as we mentioned earlier, has a lot to do with what is that borough that's under your name on the ballot. Lori Mizgorski's in Shaler, and Lissa, Ari, correct me if I'm wrong, she's either Hampton or O'Hara. I think it's Hampton, and she has some family in here. And so, I think that's going to play a lot of role in looking at turnout. But Lissa's messaging is phenomenal right now. She is talking about everything that Ari mentioned earlier that we should be talking about right now, and that's, working families. She is a working mother who actually gave birth on the campaign trail a couple months ago. And so I think it's fascinating to see the way that she talks about healthcare, and the way she talks about being a working mother, and the way she talks about education and where it's lacking, especially early childhood education. The way she talks about how hard it is to be a working parent right now, especially in the midst of COVID. She's done a really great job, her and her campaign staff, with their messaging. And I think that, if Lissa pulls this off, it's going to have a lot to do with the fact that she has the perspective that a lot of her voters have, and she's giving messaging that everyone can relate to. So I'm really excited about that one as well.
So on the topics of the resignation of Speaker Turzai and the what happened with the Allegheny County Democratic Council endorsement process, I want to get to Bethany's minute of range in just a moment. But Ari, I want to bring you in to give your thoughts on these races.
Well, just thinking about Mrs. race kind of nearby, it's incredible. She got more signatures. Bethany was just talking about how she's a working mom on the campaign trail, and she actually had a baby while she was campaigning. And during her primary challenge, she got more signatures than her male opponent.
She gave birth during petition season. Don't forget that. She's a badass.
She gave birth during petition season. And I think that just, again, like I talk about, like Bethany's the future of politics here in PA, and you know, even in South Carolina, Cunningham's the future. Like we've got young people, we've got moms, we've got women, we've got the first women of color in Pennsylvania statewide. Our political game is entirely different. And I think Emily Skopov is kind of in that same vein. She's a woman. She's running in, you know, slightly more conservative districts. I think she's very interesting. She lived in California for a while. She's got like this great, rich nonprofit background as well. So we're seeing kind of more non-traditional candidates in terms of like their background and their world experiences. But actually, that's a good thing because we're making our democracy filled with more real people in a way. I think that Emily Skopov is going to have an upward climb, but I think it's winnable just because in the last 2 years ago when she ran, she came close, I think by about 3,000 votes. And it was, yeah, very close. I think what she'll have to really master is messaging. And I think also voter targeting is a big thing. Like we kind of were discussing earlier about turnout is the main thing now. We've got to get away from this mentality. The media is constantly like, oh, you got to go after swing voters. You got to go after swing voters. I think her campaign is going to have to really work on voter persuasion. And make no mistake, Mike Turzai may have gone into retirement, but he's still going to be in the private sector, and he's still going to be giving money and trying to eventually buy up seats all across Pennsylvania. So while he may not formally be in our anymore, he's still challenge too. I mean,
so go ahead.
If I could just say one more thing, going off what Ari just said, I actually think that Emily was killing it in 2018 with the messaging of like anti-Turzai messaging. Everyone, I mean, obviously people who live in other countries know how bad Turzai is, right? And so he had this reputation really of this political villain, right? And so if I was working on Emily Skopov's campaign, one of the things that I would try really hard to do is to really align Rob Mercury with Turzai and make sure that people know that just because it's a new face and just because it's a new name, it's still Mike Turzai. It's the candidate that Mike Turzai endorsed in the Republican primary. Because remember, that was a really competitive primary as well. And that's something that I'm hoping really works to Emily's advantage in the general, is that she was, unchallenged in her primary, whereas there were three good Republican candidates who really dueled it out in the primary, and Rob ultimately pulled away with it. But if I was Emily in her campaign, I would make sure that I remind folks, this person was endorsed by Mike Turzai. This person is funded by Mike Turzai. Just because his name is not Mike Turzai does not mean that he does not stand for all of the things that we hated about Mike Turzai, and remind voters of that. And I think that that's how Emily does it too.
So this brings me, speaking of Mike Turzai, this brings me to a segment I like to call Bethany's Minute of Rage, because there's a big story about how he ended up resigning his position as speaker, and I think it has something to do with a COVID-19 spreading in the Pennsylvania legislature, and I think that you guys have a lot to say about this. So Bethany, rage away.
Oh man, I could rage about a lot of things, Jonathan. So unfortunately with Turzai is we knew for a long time that he was resigning. He was offered a cushy job with, some gas company or oil company or some
sorry? It's Aqua America or EQT? I can't.
Yeah, so I think it's Aqua America. I think you're right? So we knew that this was coming for a while, Jonathan. We had been preparing for it. We just didn't know when. So whenever he announced that there was going to be a big announcement, it was just coincidentally at the same time that none of the GOP members of the House were wearing masks, and they were finding out that they were tested COVID positive and didn't tell anyone about it. So their Democratic colleagues, a lot of whom are friends of mine, found out in the morning that, hey, we were very likely exposed to a COVID case. And
wow. So, by the way, this has been Bethany's Minute of Rage. Oh, go. Sorry.
I said, if you were my friend and you found out you had COVID and didn't tell me and we were hanging out, I'd be pissed too. Imagine putting hundreds of folks all in the same situation all at once because of some selfish, ignorant GOP representatives in the state house. That pisses me off. So that's what I'm about today, Jonathan.
Okay. And by the way, if you want to use that segment on your Currents podcast, go right ahead. Okay. So, Joe, I'm going to bring you back in. I want to talk about three competitive congressional races that are taking place in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's first, Brian Fitzpatrick versus Christina Finello. Pennsylvania's 10th, Scott Perry versus Eugene DePasquale. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Pasquale. Okay, because we were having a debate before this about how to pronounce his name. And finally, this is probably going to be close to home for you, Bethany. Pennsylvania's 17th, Connor Lamb versus Sean Parnell. And let's start with Pennsylvania's 17th because I think it's the one that most of us here are familiar with. Sean Parnell and Connor Lamb are both veterans, and they are both facing off in a Trump +3 district. And I'm curious to know, Bethany, starting with you, where does this race stand?
With me personally? Is that what you're asking? How do I personally feel about this? Because I have a lot of thoughts about that.
A lot of thoughts about that. Well, actually, Joe, you want to give a rundown of these races first, and then we'll have Bethany go on for hours about these races?
Well, Connor Lamb is a former Marine, and he was the first in that blue wave. It was the pre-blue wave of 2017. He was the first special election to have a Democrat win. He had a very weak opponent who Trump tried to prop up a little bit, but he didn't. That guy really didn't fly off the ground. And Connor Lamb won that district, of course. Then straight after that, the districts were all changed by the Supreme Court. Very important thing to note because now there's less gerrymandering in the state. However, it doesn't necessarily mean Republicans are down and out. They looked at the different districts. Connor Lamb decided to run in 17, in PA 17 instead now, and he's running against this guy Parnell, who's a Fox News contributor. He was also a veteran in Afghanistan. He's extremely Trumpy, but he's one of these guys who's, he was anti-Trump when he went after McCain, and now he's pro-Trump, as pro-Trump as you can get. And I looked at this district and I saw that Lamb had really done well in the last time he ran in 2018, because he had to run 2017, then he switched districts in 18, and now he's running again. And he did really well in this district, and I kind of fail to see where I don't see. Maybe people just liked Connor Lamb, but maybe the district has changed again. I don't have entirely a good feel for it. He has a lot more money than Parnell. I know that's not necessarily an indicator, but it's something that everybody talks about. Parnell has 600,000 and Connor Lamb has 1.7 million. So in a Pennsylvania year, in a presidential year, I see maybe this falling to Connor Lamb again. I don't think he has it as tough as you think he sees it. I don't think Parnell's a great candidate. We'll find out.
Yeah, I just want to say this was actually a classic example in 2018 of an incumbent versus incumbent. Keith Rothfuss and Connor Lamb actually ran against each other, and because their districts overlapped, and Connor Lamb ended up decisively knocking off Rothfuss. And that's it's. For election junkies, it's a rare sight and a great sight to see. But I definitely want, Ari, do you want to jump in here, because I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this as well.
Lamb, but it's in that district, I think there's even a possibility for an even more left-wing challenger than Lamb. Not in the immediate future. I think Lamb's got a lot of money. He's got a huge war chest. I think that will make it a lot easier for him. He's really well liked as well. But for me personally, he's voted with Wall Street over Main Street. I know Trump hates Lamb, and that will play out excellent in certain areas. But I think that for me, I would just love to see even a more progressive Democratic challenger further down the road.
Bethany, do we have a primary challenge declaration today?
No, you're not getting that from me.
Oh, okay, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I don't want to run for office every 2 years. That sounds like hell. But anyways, I agree 100% with Ari. And that's what I think is, to me, as someone who knocked a lot of doors for Connor Lamb whenever he was running against Keith Rothfus, I really think that this is an interesting race because I think Connor Lamb was the perfect candidate for that when he ran against Rick Saccone. I think that was the special election that he ran first off. So now remember how much national press was on that seat, right? It was a vacant seat, and it was Rick Saccone versus Connor Lamb. It was former District 18. And so whenever Connor Lamb ran in that special, it was, again, not at the same time as any other race because it was a special election. And there was money pouring into that race from all over the country. There were people donating from all over because it was, hey, we can flip a seat. This is a really flippable seat. Connor Lamb, with his background, was the perfect person for that more conservative district. In his current district, which remember is about, I don't know, half of Allegheny County, Beaver County, and a little sliver of Butler County, it's a very different seat. We've flipped a lot of conservative Democratic seats, the progressive Democratic seats, just since Connor Lamb has been elected. I mean, you saw in the primary this year some perfect examples of that. And so I think that's what I'm really interested to see is, as Ari mentioned, all of the time since Connor Lamb's been in office that progressives have been let down by some of his votes. There was a point early on in his tenure where he had voted 50% of the time with Republicans and 50% of the time with Democrats, like exactly 50-50 split. So I know that there are a lot of folks who are, disenchanted with how he has voted over the past couple of years. And those are the more progressive folks who were the grassroots organizers, who were the ones that out knocking doors for him because we knew how bad Rothfus was and we couldn't wait to get rid of him. I'm hoping that people are able to see that Sean Parnell is equally, if not more dangerous than Keith Rothfus was because of how closely he's aligned himself with Trump. If you look on Twitter, Trump has tweeted, against Connor Lamb and in favor of Sean Parnell multiple times. There was like a 2-day period where he had sent out like 4 or 5 tweets about Sean Parnell. And so I'm hoping that, the anti-Trump sentiment is what carries Connor Lamb to victory. But I also think that it's going to be interesting to watch. How do we, is Connor Lamb's campaign going to be able to figure out how to campaign in COVID-19 when we can't go and knock doors, when you don't have volunteers who are willing to go out and risk their health and well-being to participate in canvassing and in getting out the vote, where you don't have the events that you're used to going to and speaking at and getting attention for your campaign. All of that is different right now, and we've seen some more conservative candidates who weren't able to figure out how to effectively utilize social media. Connor has made some troubling statements on, social media over the past day, but like over the past few weeks and months as well. And so I'm just really interested to see how that all plays out. If the people who worked so hard to get Connor elected are going to be able to and willing to work that hard again to make sure that we keep that blue seat. So I don't know what happens in the race. Again, anything can happen. I'm excited to see how it plays out.
I think Joe's right. The outlet I'm following actually has the race rated likely D. So I think that they recognize that Connor Lamb has a unique strength, and he'll probably outperform Joe Biden in this district, just because with his strength with white working class voters from Beaver County as well as in parts of Allegheny County. So it's going to be one to keep an eye on. The one that I think is probably the most fascinating for me is Pennsylvania's 10th, where Scott Perry is facing a challenge from Democrat Eugene Pasquale, which is the thing that stands out to me is the fact that when DePasquale ran for a re-election for auditor in 2016, he carried this district. And so a lot of people think he's going to be a strong candidate. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts on this particular race. Anyone can jump in. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
I looked at DePasquale. He's known as one of the front row officers in Pennsylvania. You know, they have the state treasurer, they have the attorney general, and they have the auditor general. As we've talked about that race before, he's had 2 terms as auditor general. He's term limited. He decided to throw his hat in here. He's got a good amount of campaign money. Not quite as much as Perry, but it's pretty close. It's pretty even. It's going to be a dogfight there. Perry has been in for 3 or 4 terms, and he's a veteran, and he's a big Trump supporter. There's a lot of edgy Trump country out there, but there's a lot of suburbs of York and Harrisburg that are really Democratic strongholds now. I think that DePasquale and I find Perry to be. I don't know enough about DePasquale and what his strengths and weaknesses are, but I find Perry to be just a kind of generic Trump supporter. He's not too flashy, but he's just one of these run-of-the-mill candidates that managed to win over and over. And I think he's in for a surprise this time. He's got a guy who's no slouch, who's been in the front row in Pennsylvania for 8 years now, knows what he's doing. He's got a good bank account, and I think it's going to be tight.
You ladies? We're all in agreement. Oh, go ahead.
I think it's going to be tight. There was a primary. DePasquale did have a primary opponent, and it kind of got a little dirty, that race in the primary, with some accusations that were thrown around against both sides. So I'm just interested to see how that plays out. I mean, I think it's something that
he jumped in right at the end and supported DePasquale, though he didn't. There were no sour grapes at the end.
Right, but during the campaign, when they were both in it, in the primary, it was not nice. There was some claims. I don't know, maybe Ari remembers exactly what it was about, but it was something about campaign finance and money being used for the congressional race with funds from the auditor general race, which again, Eugene DePasquale did deny those claims. I don't know whatever came of it, but I do know that just based off of people that I follow who are more familiar with the area, like friends of mine on social media, there was a lot of hard feelings from them about that race as well, whether depending on what side they were on of that. So something I always worry about when you have a primary that plays out like that, at least while it's happening, is I worry if there's people who just won't vote at all, who will write something else in, people who are just so vehemently against the candidate that they are just not gonna support them despite the fact that they are the Democratic nominee. It's something that I see as having happened, with Joe Biden, and how literally knocked out, drag out the primary was between Bernie and Biden and so how many people I know who have no desire to support Joe Biden because of just the fact that we had a better option and we didn't take it. But in this race, I don't know what's going to happen. I hope Eugene's able to pull it off. I mean, seats that we can pick up is a huge bonus. And so I'm just really eager to see how what happened in the primary plays out in the general. And if Eugene has enough name recognition and support there, that he can pull this off, because Scott Perry's got to go.
Okay. Ari, did you want to weigh in here?
I pretty much agree with what Bethany's saying. I think Eugene's got the advantage, at least slightly, over name recognition. I think that will carry him far. Another thing that is just kind of interesting, here in Allegheny County, we've had a lot of protests for Black Lives Matter. You've seen all kinds of student activists all over the state digging into financial records. And one of the things that Eugene's been challenged on, is the fact that he's taking fraternal order police donations. And while I don't think that speaks to areas outside of maybe, Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, I do think it's important, and it shows that, our demographics are changing, voter issues are changing. I think the New York Times recently had a piece where people under age 35 very strongly, like something like 60% believe that we put too much funding into the police. So I think that some of the issues that you'll see come up in maybe not this election, but at least in the years ahead are going to be a lot more interesting. And I think that Democrats will have that advantage over Republicans in those areas too.
Well, ladies, I know that it's been a hard time talking about how Philadelphia bucked the Pittsburgh establishment in picking a nominee for auditor. But we are going to be talking about the last is in the Philadelphia suburbs. So it's Brian Fitzpatrick versus Christina Finello. Joe, I think you're going to talk about this, but Brian Fitzpatrick has the distinction of being one of 3 Republicans in the House of winning re-election in 2018 in seats that Hillary Clinton won. And I always found that Bucks County is a very unique place politically. And I just want to know if you have any thoughts on this race.
Well, Brian Fitzpatrick, he's my kind of Republican. He's a bipartisan who believes in climate change, who believes in some of these gun control issues, who, does work well with the Democrats. I know that he has had a lot of luck lately with his opponents, and it looks like he might have been lucky again with this candidate, Finello, because I guess a stronger candidate dropped out because of some social media postings, or she had yelled something at a council meeting. I can't remember, some very poor remarks on her part, so she had to drop out. Finello won. Finello suffers the same problem that Arrington in South Carolina suffers from. She doesn't have much money. I just looked at her FEC report. Fitzpatrick, out of all the candidates here that you've looked at for Pennsylvania House races, has the most money of any candidate. Now, he's been a little lucky, and it's one of these things that, are these creatures, these moderate centrist Northeast Republicans, are they doomed to extinction? Can he pull it out again? He's part of a political family as well. His brother held the seat. Unfortunately, his brother just died recently. He's one of these guys that seems to me like, and I used to confuse them, like Costello, who I thought, they're basically moderate centrist Republicans that can work well with others and aren't big Trump supporters. But even Fitzpatrick now feels this Trump, weight of doom crushing him. And it's going to be interesting to see how he manages that this time in the election. Finello's, starting out from nothing. I really thought that, if there was a strong candidate with a good bank account here against Fitzpatrick, they could beat him because that district is changing. And, these Democrats are coming into those centrist moderate positions now. They're taking those races. And but Fitzpatrick has been lucky again. I think he's going to pull it out again.
Your thoughts, ladies?
I'm not familiar enough with this race.
Okay, but I'll definitely say is I actually disagree with you, Joe. I think that this race is a toss-up because the way I see it, in 2018, Fitzpatrick got lucky. He had the pleasure of going up against who I thought was a terrible Democratic candidate, Scott Wallace. He was not from the district. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh. He's not from the district, and there was accusations, I think, of him being anti-Israel. There's a large Jewish community in that district, and he ended up only beating him by 2.6%. And so I think if we're looking at an environment in this year that looks anything like what we saw in 2018, I think Fitzpatrick is in more trouble than people think he is. It's an expensive district to campaign in, and so his money advantage will certainly be an asset. But I think that the fundamentals might not favor Fitzpatrick as much as people think. It's probably his race to lose, but I think it's going to be very competitive.
So you're seeing the extinction of moderate Republicans as we know them.
Right, and I also don't see Fitzpatrick as like a John Katko. He the kind of Republican who would overperform by double digits over the Republican presidential line. I think this is going to be a very close race.
Well,
is there anything?
I think Fitzpatrick has the luck of the Irish. He's got a candidate who just squeaked by in the primary. She doesn't have a lot of money. She's got a lot of ground to make up. If she can make it into a national race, maybe that'll help her. But he's got that big bank account where he can just flood the airwaves in late October, November, and she's got to get some money going for her.
Okay. Is there anything? Oh, go ahead.
That we see the extinction of moderate Democrats as well. So
I know that Bethany, you've been hard at work on that project.
Yeah.
Yeah. If any final thoughts on anything we've talked about or anything else you guys want to talk about?
It's all about Trump and it's all about the virus. Every single race comes down to that. I think it's going to be every one of these House races is going to be, you put our kids to school too soon. You didn't put our kids to school. We need the kids to go to school. It's all about the virus. It's all about whether you manage the virus right. It's all about whether you care about it. It's all about Donald Trump. So that's going to be very difficult for Republicans in some of these districts. Like Perry could be edged out by DePasquale. I just think it's all about the virus, all about Trump.
The races that I've been paying most attention to, I am a big fan. All politics is local. So to me, if we want to win the White House, the way we do that is we flip the down ballot race. We organize around those. So that's where I'm going to be spending most of my time, is because in that situation, I don't see it as being all about Trump. I agree for the congressional races. I think that that's where that plays into. But when we're talking about like the state house races, which if we could flip the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania, our lives would be drastically changed. And I think that we'd see things like the legalization of marijuana, and we'd see things like restoring voting rights to folks who are currently serving sentences while they're incarcerated. And so we'd see a lot of things like that. And that's what I'm most concerned about. And I don't see that as much of a moratorium on Trump, or on Trump, as I do as how are you going to help us? We are all struggling. I think a lot of it's going to be about unemployment. So many folks that I know personally who still have not received a dime from unemployment. And it's, I know when I have a constituent, I can call up my state rep or my state senator and they help me help them. And so I think it's going to be a lot about what did you do to help us? Because people don't see, aside from the fact of when you had the vote to try to overturn Governor Wolf's shutdown, aside from that, a lot of it has been about how can we help you right now? How can we make sure that you're getting your unemployment? How can we make sure that you health care? You talk about the issue of daycare whenever we have two working parents and schools aren't open. So I see it more along the lines of that, access to food, access to health care, how the school reopenings are going to be handled. I think we'll see a lot more when it comes to that time, because we're only about a month or so away from that. And I know a lot of people are very polarized on that issue and the issue of wearing masks in school. Is it even safe to reopen once that happens? And that will have a lot to do with our state legislatures. And I think how they handle that will be what the election is a referendum about. So that's just my opinion. Ari,
you want to have closing thoughts and I'll give mine?
So for me, it's just about real people building it from the grassroots up. We've got to focus on down ballot races for Democrats. So what Bethany is saying, we got to flip state house. We got to win it back for Democrats. While Joe Biden is polling ahead in a lot of polls for Pennsylvania, we shouldn't get too comfortable. We learned in 2016, you can't always trust the polls.
Yeah.
And we've got to focus really, just like Joe and Bethany both said, on helping people. We've got 2.2 million unemployed. There is not going to be a second stimulus. And we're heading into, possibly a Great Depression of sorts. We're heading into a vast structural economic change. And, things are really bad. People are really hurting right now. So we need real people that are able to connect with voters on those issues and just really turn it around for us, because there's just a lack of leadership right now in all places of the U.S. and especially the presidency. I hope we can flip it and win it back for Pennsylvania.
Well, I certainly in a little bit. I agree with Joe. This election is going to be about Trump. You have people, Democrats who are angry about Trump. You have also people on my side, contra what some people would say. You have people on my side who are enraged about Trump as well. They want to vote for a Democrat, and I think a Democrat like Joe Biden can win those votes over. And I think that the key is to keep the focus on him, and because people want him gone. That is something that I think that there is bipartisan support for, the idea that Trump needs to go. And I think that the Democrats who recognize that are going to be the ones who do the best this November. Allegheny County Councilor Bethany Hallam, former spokesperson for the Olivia Bennett campaign, Ari Teer, and former candidate against Lindsey Graham, Joe Reynolds, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
And if you like this episode, please feel free to subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you again for another episode.